I've been trying to warn Christians about the practice of looking at star constellations in order to predict the rapture or predict prophetic events. But I've probably had over 100 people bring up the story of the Star of Bethlehem and the Wisemen. So let's talk about it. The story can be found in Matthew chapter 2, verse 9, and it says, "And the star that they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was." So many people believe that this thing that we're calling a star was not a star in the traditional sense of the word, but that it was actually the Shekinah glory of God. Think back to the story of Exodus and the Israelites in the wilderness. There was a pillar of cloud and fire that actually guided the people, and it was a manifestation of the presence of God. Some people also believe that maybe what we're calling a star was actually an angel of some sort directing the wise men. There's also natural explanations too. Some believe that the Star of Bethlehem was a conjunction of planets that possibly included Jupiter and Venus and would have been visible to the eye. Others have said that the Star of Bethlehem was some kind of comet or supernova. Some have said that it was some kind of direct revelation from God that was miraculous. Others also point to prophecies like Micah 5:2, which predicted that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Others have said that once they figured out the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, they went there and talked to locals and people pointed them to where Jesus would be. In other words, there are so many different theories and explanations from smart, credible, godly people, but the truth is the Bible just doesn't give us a lot of information on that. We have to be really careful using a story like that to give us permission to start looking at the Virgo constellation and trying to figure out what's going to happen based on that, because that is honestly a form of divination. We also can't forget that Satan actually takes scripture out of context in order to try and harm Christians. Satan actually quoted Psalm 91 out of context to get Jesus to jump off a cliff. But Jesus knew the totality of scripture and was able to counter by saying it is written. And we have to do the same thing when people try to come to us with taking stories or scriptures out of context and trying to get us to do something that the Bible has already prohibited. Colossians 2:8 says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ." Satan is constantly trying to tempt us and lure us to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil instead of putting our attention on Jesus. And every time I've seen people trying to consult the stars to predict the rapture, not only is it a fruitless endeavor that never comes to pass, but I've also seen some people really get derailed and get sucked into darker and darker deceptions. I definitely understand that some people believe that the 12 zodiac symbols were originally used to tell the gospel story and that they've been corrupted by the New Age, but that still doesn't get around the fact that nowhere in the Bible are we told to look at constellations to predict future events. And there's some major practical problems with this too. Different groups of people have categorized the stars in different ways. The stars aren't in the same positions that they were in ancient times. And I don't know about you, but I can't even really see the stars where I live. So I find it really unlikely that God would say, I'm going to take a group of stars that most people can't see, most people can't name, most people can't identify, and I'm going to make my people learn them, but didn't put anything in the Bible about it. And then I'm going to make people get star apps that they have to spend hours figuring out and tinkering with to discover the signs in the heavens. That actually doesn't make sense. By definition, a biblical sign and wonder is something so unusual, so rare and once in a lifetime, and so supernatural and out of the ordinary that we can't predict it. We can't get out our apps and figure out exactly what it's going to look like or how it's going to happen. God moves in his own time and in his own way. And God has already said that his thoughts and his ways are higher than ours. So I actually think it's rather prideful to think that we can get on our little Stellarium apps and figure out what God's about to do. I completely appreciate that people are looking for the signs that Jesus is coming back, but we have to make sure that they're biblical. And God just never included star configurations and the constellations as one of the signs of his return. We have really big, obvious ones like the abomination of desolation, where the Antichrist sits in the temple and declares that he's God, and the whole world's going to know about that when it happens. Now, there will be celestial events before the second coming of Jesus, like the sun being darkened, the moon turning to blood, and the book of Revelation has celestial events at the sixth seal and during the trumpets. None of those discuss a sign in the heavens that will point to a pre-tribulation rapture. And that's what people are trying to do now. They're trying to look at these star apps to try to find pre-tribulation rapture signs, and the Bible never talks about about any of that. So my concern for people is that at best, they're wasting time when they should be reading their Bible. But at worst, I am very concerned that people are actually opening up demonic doors in their life, because as I've already mentioned in other videos, I read the comments on some of these videos and people are outright talking about astrology and numerology. And I don't hear any of the people that are doing these videos warning their followers where the line is. Because for a new believer or somebody that used to be a part of the new age, they might think, oh, if it's okay to look at Virgo and Leo to predict the date of the rapture, why can't I look at it for my everyday life? And believe it or not, there's whole movements out there called Christian astrology that are using the same kind of arguments about the Star of Bethlehem or other things, trying to tell Christians that astrology is okay. So my exhortation to people is to leave all of it alone. None of it is biblical. God is also not the author of confusion. All throughout the Old Testament, God specifically warns people against the occultic practices of Babylon. And that is really where astrology comes from. And later on, the Greeks and Romans changed things up and named star configurations after gods and goddesses. And I have a hard time believing that God actually wants us to use those names and those constellations to try to predict his return. The last thing I want to say regarding the Star of Bethlehem and the Magi is that we need to learn to look at scripture in context and understand the purpose for it. There's descriptive and prescriptive verses. Prescriptive means that God is actively commanding us to do something in our everyday life, but descriptive merely means that God mentions something or describes it, but he doesn't tell us to do that thing as his followers. And I absolutely believe that that is the case with the Magi. We don't have any information about them or details about how they figured things out. God just merely describes this is what happened. We also have to ask ourselves whenever we read a Bible story, is this normative for the Christian life? Meaning, are these the kind of things that we should be expecting to see in everyday life? Because there's all kind of extraordinary miracle stories in the New Testament and the Old Testament that include events that don't happen every day. One really interesting example is found in Acts 8. In verses 39 and 40, it seems like Philip got teleported by God to a different location. Verse 39 says, when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing. Philip, however, appeared at Azotus and traveled about preaching the gospel in all the towns until he reached Caesarea. So to use this text as an example, we would say, is this descriptive or prescriptive? I would say it's definitely descriptive. God does not prescribe a method for us to be biblically translated to different places. And then we would ask, is this normative? And I would say definitely not. That seemed to be a miraculous event that happened that we don't have a ton of information on. And I would say that it's the same thing with the Magi. So I hope this was helpful. God bless you guys.